Welcome to Hargreaves Lansdown's Meet the Manager. I'm Joseph Hill, and today I'm joined by Alex Wright, manager of the Fidelity Special Situations Fund, which features on a wealth shortlist of funds selected for their performance potential. Now, Alex, the Fidelity Special Situations Fund invests in UK companies that are unloved by other investors. So what are the types of characteristics you look for in companies?
So I'm very much looking for good companies, but that aren't currently being valued as good companies currently. And so that's generally because other investors, for some reason, are shying away from investing. So it might be poor short-term performance, maybe it's an unfashionable industry, or maybe it's simply something that isn't well covered by others, particularly down the market cap spectrum.
And Alex, you've been a disciplined value investor throughout your career, but styles come in and out of favour. As a fund manager, how difficult is it to stick to that style when perhaps it's out of favour?
So I think it's a really important thing to stick with what you're good at. I think different fund managers do things differently, but I think it's very difficult to actually change your style. So knowing what works for you and keeping doing that, I think, is a key tenet. Now, there are times when that's really, really tough. Particularly, for example, if you look at the start of COVID, was a really tough period for old economy stocks that required people to meet face to face. But actually that set up an amazing opportunity to buy into those companies when conditions went back to normal. And actually, if you'd changed your style, you would have really missed out on that rally post-COVID.
One thing you've spoken about recently is market inefficiency and investors being slow to recognise change in companies. So what is it you're looking out for there, and how can you take advantage?
Yeah, so I think what the market is quite bad at doing is basically thinking that recent history is going to repeat in the future. Because in many cases, things change over time and the market anchors to what's been happening. And that's where the key inefficiency comes in, that sort of the price of a stock reflects what's happened recently, but what might be different is that things are better in future. And we're really looking for ideas where we can think about that potential and making sure that we can buy in at a reasonable valuation where that isn't predicted or priced in.
And the UK is a market that's been out of favour with investors for some time. What needs to change there for it to come back into favour?
I think that's right. The UK has been a market that's been out of favour as people have very much followed some of the exciting technology stories that have been happening in the US. But in many ways, as a contrarian, I'm not worried about that. Actually, I don't want to be in a market where there's thousands or maybe even millions of other investors competing with me to try and get an edge on a stock. I much like an out of favour market because I look for out of favour stocks. So if the market as a whole is out of favour, that gives me more opportunity to outperform. And I think we've demonstrated that over time, that the UK is a market where a good manager can outperform. Whereas actually investing in the US or maybe global markets, it's much harder to do so just because there's that much more competition there.
And reflecting on your career so far, what top investment tip have you picked up along the way?
I think it's really difficult to narrow it down to sort of one thing because there's a lot of individual things that are important, and we very much have a sort of checklist of what we look for in companies, lots of due diligence that we do around each individual name, and also a lot of help in the process at Fidelity, the 40 analysts that we have. And so it's really a collection of lots of little things that lead into the process rather than really one big thing.
And who would you say has had the biggest influence on you as an investor?
Yeah, so I think it's really interesting to look at how well investors have done over time. And I think the two key people that I've really sort of learnt from and have been helpful to me is first of all, Anthony Bolton, who used to run the fund, was a real mentor at Fidelity, but also Joel Tillinghast, who worked for our US cousin. It also has a similar sort of value style, but on a more global basis. And again, actually, he's recently retired, written a really interesting book about investing small. And I think that's a really interesting thing to look at as well.
And outside of work, how do you switch off?
So I think increasingly over time, it's been important to sort of get out of the noise and have a mental break. And increasingly as time's gone on, probably the last 5 years or so, I've really got into running. And so not serious distances, but sort of up to sort of half marathon. And mentally, I find that really stimulating, that you can really sort of turn off and be away from sort of any influence for sort of an hour or two, which really helps with a job which is obviously high stress, like investment.
Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.